Hi, folks. Welcome to Trine Time. I'm Lars, and I'm here with Alex and James once again. Today, we're going to be talking about Saturn's transit through Capricorn, which starts at about December 19th this year, 2017, and lasts till
December
December 17th, 18th, was it?
16th or 17th. Yeah.
16th or 17th in 2020. And before we started, I just randomly pulled this card, an appropriate card for Saturn. I do think so. And so
What
let's just,
what card was that, Lars?
this is the Nameless Arcana, also known as the Death card in later decks. This is the Tarot Marseille, which is a French deck from, I don't know, 14th, 15th century or so.
Okay, cool.
So, yeah, let's just get right to it. James, you were talking about Saturn meeting up with Pluto, his buddy Pluto, for the United States Pluto
Right.
return. And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, generally, I'd like to talk about Saturn and Capricorn. I think that my first thought would be about what does that mean. So I think we should probably just kind of introduce the idea of Saturn in Capricorn in general, and in order to like lay some groundwork here for those who may not be familiar with it. So Saturn, in my mind, Saturn represents, darkness or fear or death or the lack of something, right? It was actually a conversation Lars and I had not too long ago in which I was speaking about how Saturn is considered the planet that kind of rules the construct of our reality. But if you think about Saturn, Saturn is darkness, Saturn is death, Saturn is limitation. And really, all of those things are the absence of something else, right? So, the absence of light, the absence of security, the absence of freedom, and so, or the absence of life, even. So, the nature of Saturn as being the planet of reality kind of shows us that Saturn is like the shadow cast by the light of something else. But so anyway, that was my first thought about Saturn, and I wanted to share that. And then I think later on I'll talk about maybe the Pluto and Saturn conjunction.
Sure, sounds good. And Alex, you had mentioned that you had an experience where somebody, their first Saturn return was very difficult, while their second was not as difficult. And we're going to be talking a bit about Saturn returns today because that's always on everybody's mind with Saturn. So, did you want to say something about that or something else, perhaps?
Well, yes. In regards to that, that would not have been my first pick to talk about. But since you mentioned it, I think it's quite important for those that are going through their first Saturn return, as well as for those who are going through their second Saturn return, to know that Saturn is about establishing some boundaries, establishing structure, establishing something firm, something solid. But it is also about, as James said, about the construct of our reality. And what is the construct of our reality? Our entire holographic reality is based on a sort of memory that the mental fabric has. And this memory basically holds everything in place as it is. The only reason that an object is the same way minute after minute after minute after minute is because it has a certain memory, and that memory is called karma, right? And we know that Saturn is associated with karma. Now, without going into past life stuff, Saturn is a very karmic planet, and it is a planet of karmic retribution. And the first Saturn return may see some powerful themes of karma, of something needing to be repaid in our life in a karmic sense. Now, for those who really face this challenge during their first Saturn return, for some it's going to be trickier than for others, obviously. And we'll get into some of the details of that as well. But the challenges, the hardships that people face with their first Saturn return. I see people talking around astrology groups like, oh, my Saturn return is coming, I'm going to lock myself in a room and all of that, you know. Well, good luck with that, because if you lock yourself in a room and you run away from that, you're going to have to face more of that with your second Saturn return. Exactly. And there'll be nowhere to hide. So I'm saying, whether you're a lady, whether you're a guy, just man up. And if Saturn is bringing some hardship, some challenge to your doorstep, just get out in your underpants, in your robe, however you are, and just face it, because the second time around, you're going to be less enthusiastic about dealing with these kinds of challenges. So yeah, that's kind of my my take on my advice for people going through their first Saturn return.
Yeah, that's some good stuff there. That makes a lot of sense, and I think it's easy for us to focus on that doom and gloom aspect of Saturn, because indeed there's no denying it. You know, he is very much about doom and gloom in many ways. He's considered the greater malefic of ancient astrology, and for a very good reason. You know, he's also the slowest planet. He's the furthest from the sun that we can visibly see throughout most of the year, besides, you know, Uranus's, you know, once in a while visibility. And so, you know, that makes him cold and dark and dry and things like that. And it's no coincidence that the ancients placed him as the ruler of Capricorn and Aquarius, which, you know, in the northern hemisphere coincide with the dark and cold period of winter, the signs that are opposite the sun and the moon. And in Neoplatonic philosophy, we find that Capricorn was the gate of death, while Cancer was the gate of incarnation, taking the physical body. So Saturn and Capricorn, I personally feel like, even though, you know, in some ways Saturn may be better placed in Aquarius for reasons I won't go into now, I've always associated Saturn more with Capricorn, more with that, you know, that gate with, going through that dark tunnel and whatnot. And in any case, one thing that's interesting is how the two signs that Saturn rules, he's the only planet that rules two signs right next to each other. And what I was saying earlier before we started the recording about Janus, the two-faced god in Roman mythology, Janus is the god of gateways and beginnings and endings. So he looks toward both the past and toward the future. And it's sort of like Capricorn and Aquarius are the two faces of Janus. So we're going to have these two faces of Janus. It's almost like while Saturn's in Capricorn, we may collectively be reflecting on the cold, harsh reality of the past. And when he's in Aquarius, we'll be reflecting on the more hopefully warmer potentials of the future. Aquarius tends to be a very idealistic, optimistic sign, but oftentimes that idealism gets smashed by Saturn's cold, hard realities. So I guess that's what I have to say for right now.
Right. That's actually that's a good point about Aquarius. And actually, this is something I want to bring up for people who may not consider the traditional rulerships. Because for a long time, I didn't use traditional rulerships. I used modern rulerships because that's how I learned astrology. And and then whenever I switched over to using traditional rulerships, I really struggled to understand Saturn's rulership of Aquarius. But then I realized, I think that I listened to something by Rob Hand, and then I also spent a lot of time thinking about this. And it actually makes a lot of sense, because Aquarius is not just, I guess, about idealism, but actually about taking your hopes and dreams and bringing them into reality. And so in society, I think it's about social progress. And so it's not about just disregarding all rules, because people tend to say that, like Uranus ruling Aquarius or whatever. But that's not the case with Aquarius. It's not about disregarding rules in general. It's about establishing new social rules, new markers for where we are, and moving, I guess, the land marker forward, instead of just disregarding all constructs that in general. So I just wanted to throw that out there as why we, how we can see Saturn as the ruler of Aquarius and it still be congruent with our understanding of Saturn being the planet that marks boundaries, right? And represents the limitations, because all of our ideas are constructs in society and how we deal with everything. So just wanted to throw that out there for anyone who might be wondering how Saturn relates to Aquarius.
Right. I totally agree with that. And it's important to understand the essence of Saturn, which is that of establishing boundaries. Boundary is as I see it, it's the core essence of Saturn. It's at the boundary of the visible planets. It's at the boundary between the luminous solar system and the dark solar system, right? And in our life, it provides the boundary between our luminous being, right? It's the root chakra, the chakra that is rooted in the denser dimensions and only lets pass those denser energies that the being can successfully transmute into higher frequencies of vibration. Understand that Saturn is the planet of boundaries is going into Capricorn. We have to talk about that. The keyword that I use, the fundamental keyword that I use for Capricorn is selectivity. Now, I have gotten suggestions. Why don't you use pragmatism? Why don't you use practicality for Capricorn? Well, that's very human. Those are very human qualities. Pragmatism, right? Practicality. Those are human qualities.
Sure.
Selectivity is a quality of nature. So for the signs and for the planets, you want to use keywords and symbols that are nature symbols, and you want to use more human symbols for the houses, because that's where they channel into our human aspects of life. And why selectivity? Well, the symbol of Capricorn is the goat. Why is it the goat? Because the goat represents Baphomet, and Baphomet is supposedly Satan. And the ancient sages who consecrated these symbols were not superstitious. So the goat of Capricorn does not represent Baphomet. Actually, I think it precedes Baphomet, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it does. Yeah, I think Baphomet is a later construct, possibly created by Eliphas Levi, or at least the popular depiction is created by him.
So there was a lot of thought given to these symbols, obviously, and they were established in wisdom. What is it about the goat that shows the qualities of Capricorn and of Saturn? If you go to a store and buy goat's milk, you will hear that goat's milk is very healthy because it has particular quantities of just the right minerals.
Yeah.
That's because the goat doesn't just go out and graze and just eat everything. The goat is very particular about what to eat, when to eat, and how much of it to eat. It's very, very selective. It won't eat just anything, not at any time, not in any quantity. It's very, very selective. And that's the quality of Capricorn, being selective about material things. That's why we see Capricorns in high positions, right? In selective environments. They're very selective about how they act. If you have Moon in Capricorn, you're selective about how you put out your emotion and your experiences of life. If you have Sun in Capricorn, you're very selective about you fall back, how much you shine here, how much you shine there, right? And so with Saturn going into Capricorn, the gatekeeper goes into the sign of selectivity, so he flourishes there. But at the same time, in our personal life, in the world, we can debate forever on what this may bring, but obviously we will get to see soon. But in our personal life, it is about being very careful and very conscious about where we establish the limitations and boundaries within our own life, and especially in the things represented by the house of Capricorn in our personal natal chart. If we don't do this consciously with Saturn passing here, and especially if we have our Saturn return, those boundaries are going to get hardened by themselves and we will have no say in it. So basically, boundaries are going to be established in our area of life controlled by Capricorn. It's our choice whether we want to participate in that and do it in a way that it's practical for our future endeavors, or just get limited being established.
So you're breaking up sometimes, Alex. I'm just letting you know that sometimes you're breaking up.
Well, that's my internet over here in Transylvania. So,
well, yeah, all those things you said are really excellent points. I don't know too much about Makara, which is the Indian version of Capricorn, which is a crocodile. Sometimes it's a crocodile with a deer's head. Very, very strange imagery. I did want to just throw that out there. I was just reading Valens, and he talks about how Capricorn is two-natured because it's this sea goat, right? And it's this strange creature that just does not exist. Pretty much every other sign.
Which really goes back to this idea of like, we say that Saturn is reality, but it's actually like
it's kind of the illusion in some ways. It's like the Maya.
It's Maya, exactly what I was thinking. It's the illusion of this world.
And Valens,
everything is illusion. There's nothing actually real of anything. So,
that's definitely a strong truth. And Saturn represents deception and masks. And Valens talks about this, and he mentions this, that Saturn is like associated with those who wear a mask. And I think it's interesting too that Saturn is associated with Lord Brahma by Parashara. And it's like, what is that telling us? Well, it's telling us that Brahma he's in charge of creating these different aspects of reality. He's sort of draping like a veil over the true nature of the supreme Brahman. And there's even a story where Brahma lusts after I think it's Parvati. I think he lusts after Parvati.
Who doesn't, right?
Well, forgive me. Yeah, anyone watching this, forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, but he lusts after Parvati, and then basically there's a few different versions of the story, but at a certain point, like Brahma realizes the errors of his ways, because Parvati is technically his daughter because he created her, but he ironically created her to be his consort. And so he's lusting after her, and then he realizes the error of his ways, and so he casts off. He like recreates his body, and he casts off his old shell, and that body becomes like almost like a rotting, fetid corpse. It becomes like some weird like shadow energy, and so it's kind of a reminder of how like Saturn represents, in many ways, it's like wherever Saturn is in the chart and whatever it's doing, it's like something we go after seeking some kind of fulfillment, but then it actually tends to bring harsh lessons because it brings emptiness and suffering, not because it's like an evil planet, but because it's more like that's where we get shown, okay, this is how life is limited and all of reality is limited without the realization of God. Well, and so that's very much a Saturn theme, is like you're going after this, but it's like sour grapes. It's like the goat's milk itself actually is a little bit bitter, because I've drunk goat's milk a lot, and especially if the males are there, like around, the females will release like a hormone, and that hormone actually makes the milk even more bitter. So you can have like this really good milk, but it also brings this bitterness with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. A couple of things of what you said. I've also thought about this idea of deception. And I go to this like meetup that talks about the Tarot and Kabbalah, and there's a lot of astrology in all of this. And the Devil card is associated with Saturn.
Oh, definitely.
And one of the things, and one of the things that they say is that the devil is not actually like the devil, but it's an angel. I can't remember the name of the angel. That it's just like concealing himself. And that if you can get through the illusion, then you can, get to this like angelic being or whatever. And so I think that part of this idea of Saturn is that if you can get through the illusions of this world, all of the things that you fear, like, because all of your fears are illusions, you can get to the spiritual gold and the wisdom that Saturn has to offer. So it's like, instead of seeing Saturn, I guess, as being like the devil itself, it's more like the idea that Saturn just has like the goal of seeing how are you willing to do the work to get the reward, right? And so, are you willing to see through the illusions? Are you willing to bring more light into the dark places?
Nah.
And so, because okay, because
I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
Okay, 1 second. So, because sorry, I'm going to lose my train of thought. So, like, bringing the light into those dark situations, or whatever it is. Sorry, I can't remember, but I don't know what I was going to say. Anyway, so those are just some points that I wanted to make about that.
Yeah, it sounds like you're implying that Saturn brings us into something dark, and then it's up to us to shine a light in that darkness. Is that kind of
sort of? Not really, because I don't think that
okay?
I don't think that Saturn brings us into anything. I think that it just represents an archetypal image of what is, and so yeah, because I don't think the planets actually cause anything.
Oh,
I think that it's right. Yeah,
more of a
right.
metaphor. Yeah, sorry.
Right. Yeah, I just think that they're all like archetypes of how we experience, life, and we project ourselves onto the planets and onto the signs, and I think that it represents our quest for enlightenment and all of the darkness we have to go through on our way to that place of light.
Yeah, that makes sense. Alex, did you want to say anything in response to that?
Certainly I would have something to say, and this ties in perfectly with the idea of Saturn being the boundary. Because if you think about it, there's this human spirit, there's this human soul that lives here in this illusion of concrete physical reality. We can't go beyond this wall unless we open the door. If the door is locked, we have to find the key. These kinds of limitations of the physical world. And these limitations are Saturn, the boundary constructed around our consciousness to keep us in this reality. But if we can escape these boundaries, right, as James pointed out, Saturn is the one that conceals the light which comes from beyond. Saturn is the one that keeps us here, but beyond it is a world of limitless freedom, right? Limitless light.
Yep.
So Saturn is just the boundary, I guess the deity that makes sure that you are right, you are set right, you function properly as a conscious entity when you finally get to break free of its limitations. So it basically forces the human soul, the human spirit, the human consciousness to develop certain qualities before it can escape, so that it can escape. And then once it escapes the boundaries, the fears, the limitations of Saturn, then with these qualities that it has developed thanks to Saturn's pressures, then it will have all that it needs to explore the limitless potential of the universe. So that's my take on that, and I think it ties into what James just beautifully said.
Cool. So what do we think then about Saturn's transit through Capricorn, just on the world stage in a general way? I mean, is it going to be really good for farmers, for example? Is it, are we going to see some structures, some limitations in government or at the state level, come into play in a bigger way than Saturn and Sagittarius?
Definitely this will be a time, these 2 years will be a time where boundaries will be subject to scrutiny, and we will develop new boundaries. Of course, over there in the States, there is a wall going up, right?
Well, maybe.
Right.
But
It's
thing I just use that as an example because
I know. I've thought about it.
No offense, but I'm aware that people in the United States, which probably make up most of the people watching this video, are not really aware of what's going on everywhere else in the world. But everywhere else in the world, we're aware what goes on in the United States. That affects all of us, right?
Yeah.
So the president of the United States is not just the president of the United States. He's kind of the president of the world. So we care as well.
Sure.
But, you know, the president of Romania, like, nobody cares. I don't even care what he's doing, right? But
yeah, who is that guy again? Is it Dracula? Your president's Dracula, right?
He's some guy. I don't really like him. So that's just but I don't really have a problem with him either.
Okay.
But we will see all sorts of boundaries being reinforced, developed, revisited all around the world in our international politics, UN councils, all of this stuff. The boundaries with this 2-year transit of Capricorn, the boundaries, the limitations, the structure. I'm sorry about my internet connection here, guys. Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
The boundaries, the structures of these large global organizations are going to be revised, and new boundaries, new systems of boundaries are going to be set in place as well. And all systems are going to be destroyed. And that also goes back to Saturn meeting Pluto, which I think that James would like to touch more on on this point.
Well, and to go into what you said a little bit, I disagree a little bit. I agree with most of what you said, but I think that what you're saying about redefining the boundaries would be more Saturn's ingress into Aquarius. And I think that the emphasis will be, in my opinion, on authority structures themselves. And I also see like a bigger push for really like fascist ideas, because I think that people's fears are going to be really fed, especially by the government. And I think that we could also possibly see a loss of freedom, or lots of losses of freedom or liberties because of this transit. Now, I do agree with you about this idea of Saturn and Pluto and destroying these old, outworn authority systems. I wrote about Pluto and Capricorn last year, and I was thinking a lot about it and looking at history. And, the United States is experiencing its Pluto return. I think it's in 2020, right? And so at 23 degrees of Capricorn. And that's where Saturn and Pluto are going to meet up. And the last time Pluto was in Capricorn was during the American Revolution. But that was also a time in the world where governments and everything were up in there was a lot of tumult, right? There were a lot of rebellions against the current systems and a lot of power struggles. And so
just shortly here, the last time that Saturn was in Capricorn, a lot of boundaries were redefined because the communist bloc fell, the Berlin Wall fell, all of this. So boundaries were definitely redefined.
Oh no, yeah, I agree. I agree with that too. Yeah, you're right. And I didn't think about it from that perspective. I actually studied that quite in depth, the Berlin Wall incident and what actually happened. It was very fascinating. If we had time, I would go into it, but I don't want to get too off track. But yes, so boundaries and what they mean are important. But interestingly enough, though, I will mention along the lines of what you said, what we saw when the Berlin Wall, fell, which it didn't actually fall first whenever it was opened up for everyone. Saturn was almost exactly conjunct Neptune, which we see Neptune as being this planet representing dissolving things. And then it was exactly opposite Jupiter. Jupiter was in Cancer. And so there was a lot of things set up during that time. And it would be interesting to compare what we're going to see with Saturn and Capricorn this time versus last time, as the planets are, now in different places. So I don't know how it's going to turn out altogether with Saturn and Pluto, but I do think it's going to be a powerful issue to do with authority, power struggles, the transformation of authority systems around the world and governments. So,
yeah, wow. And then,
and I definitely agree with what you said about Saturn in Aquarius after Saturn in Capricorn. So I see it as the boundaries themselves being worked with during Saturn and Capricorn, but that's at the higher levels. But then, when these changes will seep into society, because my keyword for Aquarius is community.
Yeah.
So Saturn goes into Aquarius, that's where society will really feel these changes. will have to deal with these changes, will actually feel
Yeah.
the impact of them.
And on that note too, I want to mention real quick that Mars right over there, who's represented by this thing, will be meeting Saturn in Capricorn actually pretty soon, and so we'll have this exalted Mars with Saturn, which is a strange kind of dichotomy, of course, and I want to touch upon that in a moment. But we also have oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought. So I guess we should just talk about that Mars, because I mean,
Okay, though. Before you start, you know I'm gonna have to comment on Mars and Capricorn since that's my natal
yeah,
place.
you have both, yeah.
Right, I do.
Yeah, awesome. Well, it's just interesting because I mean, like Mars, yeah, while he's exalted in Capricorn, it could be a major boost for Jupiter in Scorpio because that'll be his dispositor.
Right.
And it's kind of an interesting thing because, Firmicus Maternus mentions that the conjunction of Saturn and Mars is in many ways productive of good because Saturn, restricts Mars and Mars energizes Saturn. But on the other hand, they're very, very opposite in what they represent. And I've often found
Oh yeah.
Mars Saturn contacts, especially hard aspects, to be indicative of like a very, very rebellious kind of person. And the only person I can think of right now who has a very close conjunction of Mars and Saturn in another Earth sign, actually in Virgo, is H.P. Blavatsky. And, part of the way that might have worked out in her life is, she was always fighting these institutions, whether it was like the Psychical Research Society or the psychism groups that were kind of like channeling and doing seances. And she was fighting Christianity because they were after her. And so she's always like fighting these establishments. She was always like trying to tear down these walls. And she was doing it through esoteric philosophy and writing 1,500-page books and things like that. So it's a very interesting conjunction, and they're both very empowered in that sign. So it could be like too many cooks in the kitchen. I don't know.
That's actually like I have a really good friend. She has the North Node in Capricorn, and her boyfriend has the North Node in Aquarius. And she's one of my best friends, actually. And I was explaining to her that Capricorn is like winter and is like preparing for winter. And Aries is like spring and enjoying like the bounty of spring. And she said that was like the most true thing she'd ever heard about like the dynamic of their relationship,
Oh, wow.
And so I think that with Mars in Aries is like kind of like the young warrior who's like, really fresh and really like energized and really rushing into battle. And Mars in Capricorn is like the seasoned general who takes a step back, waits, and contemplates because they're thinking about the consequences of their actions more, right, than Mars in Aries, which is really quick to act. And so they're both cardinal signs, so there's this theme of action. But with Aries, it's very like quick action. And with Capricorn, it's like building momentum. And the action comes after a period of, like I said, contemplation, thoughtfulness, and foresight. So that was just like what I wanted to add to the thought.
That's interesting. Yeah. Alex?
Well, with Mars in Capricorn, like what I foresee happening, and I'm willing to bet large sums of whatever on this. I was gonna say money, but that's not. I don't have large sums of money.
Bags of cash.
Bags of cash. So, with Mars also going into Capricorn, keep in mind that in Virgo, as you said, you gave that example of someone having Mars and Saturn in Virgo, but at the same time, Mars does awful in Virgo because Mercury is an enemy to Mars.
Yeah, that's true.
It makes it really indecisive, not in the sense where Mars in Capricorn is, careful about is diligent about how to act. Mars in Virgo is just indecisive. It's just scared to act, indecisive, right? But going back to Mars and Capricorn, there's Saturn there, there's the boundary, there's Capricorn, which is the establishment, the selectivity, the select few. And then there's Mars. And knowing a bit of how world affairs are at this time, because that's like my second passion after astrology,
Yeah.
I think we will see boundaries being enforced militarily,
Yeah, totally.
uh, or being like messed with militarily a lot. And we see already this kind of popping into view with like the independence of Catalonia, the independence of Kurdistan. And actually,
It's all starting. Yeah, totally.
I wrote a post about 2 months ago when the North Korea thing was in its height, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, the war is going to start in Korea." And I wrote a post like, "Listen, in 2 weeks from now, you will not remember that Korea happened. Everything will move back to the Middle East with Kurdistan, with Iran, and it already happened, right?"
Yeah.
Interesting.
And now, with all of these chips kind of falling into place, we will see military force either defending boundaries or messing with boundaries. There will be this fired theme around boundaries, borders, establishments.
Well,
And
I mean, that's where you get the root for the word like martial law, right? It's
Martial
like,
law, yeah.
Mars, right? So it's like this enforcing rules and establishments, using force to do that, using, the military or whatever. And I don't want to get into sounding like, conspiracy theory or anything, but like I agree with you that a lot of the things that we see are oftentimes distractions from really big issues that are happening somewhere else. And I think that the thing with Korea is a good example. I think it is a legitimate issue, but there are other issues that I think were kind of like detracted from because people were not watching the other areas of the world because this was all over the news, right? So I agree with you. And to add to that, one more thing is that it's also interesting because Donald Trump natally has Mercury square Neptune. And if you follow those transits, I've been thinking about this for a long time and studying it. And I know it's a little off topic, but it goes into what you said. If you study the transits, watch Mercury making aspects to Neptune, it'll relate to a lot of things that are happening in the news and also what's happening with his administration and things he says and does. And it gives you it evokes like the idea of what is reality. And so that kind of ties into this theme with Saturn. And
Sure.
and Donald Trump being like this, like, kind of chaotic energy that makes us question reality itself. And then he's always saying things like fake news, whatever. And, just like Hitler did in Germany, saying Lügenpresse, and, called the press fake news.
Right.
So there are a lot of correlations to all of these things. And history is a great reminder of how we can be informed of what might be to come. So just wanted to throw those things out there for a minute.
Yeah, that's cool. What I'm thinking about now, to change the subject for a moment, and we can always return to this, I'm thinking a little bit about the Ashtaka Varga, sorry, Ashtaka Varga, and how, Saturn is...
what is the Ashtaka Varga?
It's a method of transit delineation in Jyotish. And I'm just going to head really simply into it, is that, and you have to look at your own chart to really properly assess this. But generally speaking, Saturn is only giving auspicious results relative to the moon when he's placed in the 3rd, 6th, or 11th house. And of course, Saturn gives, his most difficult results when he's transiting the sign before, during, and after the moon sign, which is called Sadasati, which means 7.5 years. And so for those of you watching our video, you can look at your own chart and figure out,
like,
James.
I'm like, I'm going to just pretend like that's not true and hope that that's not true. So I really just dislike that. So I'm going to pretend like it's
okay.
not.
All right. Well, in any case, there's this. It's a very interesting Ashtaka Varga. I keep wanting to say Vakra. Sorry, Varga is a very strange and interesting technique that I'm just returning to after we talked a little about it last week. But it's good to see, for you, where Saturn is from your moon, because the moon is one of the most important points in the whole chart, whether it's day or night. And because it really has to do, with your peace of mind and your ability to adapt to what's going on. It's really about, what your focus is. And we could sum it up as the habits, the unconscious, or the personality self. And so, like, I know for myself, Saturn has been, for the past, 2.5 years, in the 10th house from my moon, which is not an auspicious place for it to be. And, yeah, it's definitely been kind of rough. So if anyone's having an experience where Saturn moving into Capricorn is going to be in the 11th, the 3rd, or the 6th sign from the moon, then that might be indicative of things lightening up for you a little bit. And if it's not doing that, if it's moving into the inauspicious signs from the moon, then now's the last leg of the journey to say, okay, I'm ready to just close out the accounts that need to be closed out, and to sort of prepare for the winter, metaphorically speaking, ahead. So it's just good to know these things, because then that way, what is astrology for anyway? It's like, that way you can be like, okay, it's not the end of the world. Saturn's just in the 9th from my moon, and I've got a few more years till, things even out there. Of course, again, other things can mitigate that or change it. So but
Right.
we got to be a little general here. So
Yeah, well, and I think that it is important to recognize that there are mitigating factors in
yeah,
astrology, because, for example, I don't know how applicable it will be in my life, simply because, like, I have in my natal chart, Jupiter is trine Saturn within like 30 minutes or whatever, 30 astrological minutes, and so during this transit in Sagittarius, it was pretty good. It was okay. Like, there were some pluses and minuses to it. But at my Saturn return, I can just see the potential for this to not necessarily be as negative as people have, said, or some of the delineations say. And so
sure.
I just think it's important that that no one panic whenever they hear these delineations, because there may be other things happening that, like Lars said, will mitigate some of the harshness of the Saturn experience, so that sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it is really bad, bad or hard. That's true too. So, but I just think that it's important to have a really balanced mindset about it and not be afraid.
Yeah.
So I think if you start getting into fear, that's where you start getting trapped.
Also, keep in mind that going to the concept of Raj Yoga and Vedic astrology, I'm going to explain that briefly. A Raj Yoga is a power combination. When an angular house, a planet representing an angular house, and a trine house, angular houses are 1, 4, 7, 10, trine houses are 1, 5, 9, come together, or when one of the planets representing one of these houses transits another trine or angular house, it has the potential to produce very, very auspicious results. Now, of course, there are a lot of conditions for this, which we don't really have time to go into. However, one thing to look for is, if you are a Libra or a Taurus ascendant, this, especially if it's your Saturn return, either in Capricorn or in Aquarius 2 years from now, this may be a time where you will need to put in some work and deal with some limitations. However, the end result is likely to be very beneficial, very auspicious, if your natal Saturn is also in a good condition.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Saturn is really the planet that, if it brings success, and by the way, for Libras, that's your 4th and 5th house. If you're having your Saturn return and you've been dealing with issues of your personal security, you really didn't really have your personal security down straight, this is the time where you can establish a firm foundation, a solid foundation for that. And if you're a Taurus ascendant, regarding your career and purposes in life and public persona, that's where you have the opportunity to really establish a firm foundation and a solid structure with Saturn. It will not be easy. Nothing with Saturn is easy, but everything will be worth it if your natal Saturn is also in a good condition. So yeah, just for Venus ruled ascendants, something which is worth mentioning here, I think.
Yeah, very good point. And again, don't jump the gun on that, because there are it is very complex, and there are various ways that those great Raj yogas can be canceled, and actually they can be canceled quite easily because it seems like older astrology just loves to emphasize the more difficult stuff over the more auspicious stuff, and I think realistically it's just being honest. I mean, I think life
Right.
in many ways is more difficult than it is smooth sailing, because we're not meant to find complete fulfillment in anything in the world. We're meant to find complete fulfillment in the divine alone, however you relate to that, however you think of that. And so it's just bringing us back to that very Saturnian lesson of it actually, yeah, that I held this up earlier, the Marseille devil card. It's got the face, it's an androgynous being, it's got the face on its stomach there. And a friend of mine told me that it's probably that face is related to this concept in, I think, one of the Buddhist schools, of this demon that eats you up when you die and then shits you out when you're reborn. So it's like a very violent, kind of volatile imagery, but it's like, what does it say if you're this demon's excrement? And that's like what you are. That's what reality is. It's a very brutal.
I refuse to be a demon's excrement.
Yeah.
I feel kind of humbled by it personally, in some ways, but it's just like and the Vajrayana Buddhist schools they're I'd say it's one of the most brutal religions. It's all like very much about death and how fulfillment cannot be found without realizing, the boundless nature of existence through, the Dharmakaya and stuff like that. So, but it's like, I don't know. Anyway, I'm kind of getting a little off track, but I just think it's interesting how Saturn, the concept of Saturn, it just continues to bring us back to that cold, harsh truth of things. And when it goes through its own sign of Capricorn and then its own sign of Aquarius, we're going to be seeing this theme, perhaps more subtly throughout world events, of like being dissatisfied with what we were chasing after.
Well, I think that it's also coming back to this idea of reality. And so when we think about that in the context of like material things, and I've been talking to a lot of people about this lately, because I know what my Saturn return is about. I have no doubt. Like, I've studied this, I looked at the transits, everything. And but what I've really come up with for a lot of people is that issues connected to insecurity are like a big theme.
Good word.
And insecurity with Capricorn being an earth sign, and Saturn being fear, and a lot of it's connected back to your father and your relationship with your father. And I know that traditionally the sun is the father, and Saturn can be the father too, though. It depends on sect, right? Day or night birth, whatever. But there's all kinds of factors in that. It doesn't necessarily matter.
Well, actually, just real quick, if I could, expanding on that, I always take like the sun as the father as an individual, and Saturn as the father in his role as a father, like being the disciplinarian and giving you structure. So I always kind of look at both of them to see the father.
Well, in my own life, both of them represent different people. So I know that they're both like a father.
Okay.
And so, but anyway, so where was I? Let's see. I was talking about Saturn, and what was I talking about? I don't remember.
About Saturn as the father, and about insecurities that could come up as a result.
So what I was talking about was like this idea of insecurity. And I think that like, this is not just going to come up on a personal level. I think it's going to come up on a collective level, and that we might actually see issues in the economy where there's like some sort of like economic problem that comes up. Like in the late 80s, around the end of Sagittarius and early part of Capricorn for Saturn's transit, there was some sort of financial crisis, right? And so during the Reagan administration, I believe it was, and I was studying this, in fact, these transits of Saturn and the late degrees of fire signs. and the retrograde periods, it always seemed to precede, in all the things I looked at, some sort of economic issue, especially like what I was looking at was the United States, obviously, because that was what was most relevant to me. So anyway, the point is that I think that there's going to be a lot of issues with insecurity. And do you feel safe? Do you feel like your life is stable? Do you feel protected? Or whatever it is. And so,
yeah, that's a good point. And, for those of you out there listening, you might want to watch that South Park episode about insecurity. You guys haven't seen that?
I don't watch South Park. I just never, okay. I never liked South Park. So.
Okay. Well, there's a really good episode about this security company that people call, but it has to do with, I forget it. I forget the episode, but it's called Insecurity, like 2 words. And so it's a good episode.
Basically, if we want to learn about Saturn and Capricorn, we should watch South Park.
Maybe. You never know where you're going to find wisdom and teachings. I do want to give you a chance to respond to what James said if you want, Alex. But real quick, I also wanted to mention that we should we should talk about briefly, if we can, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that will be in Aquarius in a few years, and because it's in Saturn's sign, and it's interesting.
Well, I think that maybe that's too far down the road because of where we are right now, because that's going to be like in the early 2020s. And
who knows if we'll still be alive after?
Yeah,
who knows? But
we should say like on Capricorn right for now, because it's just so far away that it's really hard to even approach it without getting into a lot of details about what was happening last time Saturn was.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, I really have. I can't think of anything to add with to what James just said, because father themes in my life are not really like I don't know my dad, right? I've only met him once in person. I wouldn't recognize him on the street today.
I would say that's an issue.
Well, it has been. Let me put it this way: it has been an issue. I have a Saturn in the 9th house. The 9th house is traditionally the house of the father, right? I have a night chart. Saturn in the 9th house. Sun is only afflicted by Uranus, which does make sense. And Uranus is not this wonderful planet that brings all sorts of joys our way. But anyway, back to Saturn. So with regards to with regards to the theme of Saturn representing the father, I would not know. That's what I want to say. So,
well, isn't yours retrograde as well?
It is retrograde, yes.
Well, I've often observed in many charts where Saturn is retrograde that somehow the father was absent, either literally or metaphorically. Like the father somehow didn't fulfill like a key role. Like, for example, there's some friends of mine who are twins, and they both have. They actually have a different ascendant, which is a rare thing for twins, but it makes it, possible to like read their charts a little easier. But it's like one of the twins has Saturn retrograde in the 2nd house in a day chart, and they have a really terrible eating disorder. And the other twin has that same Saturn, retrograde, but it's in the 3rd house, showing the struggles of their sibling, amongst other things. But for both of them, their father, the mother kind of ran the show. The father never really like stood up or stepped in the way that a father really needs to do. So it's just a very interesting thing to observe. Anyway,
that actually brings up a good point I meant to mention, was that there's some debate, and I think that Chris Brennan talked about it on one episode of his podcast about Saturn and Saturn being seen as a feminine planet at one point in history. And so whenever I look at Saturn in a natal chart, I always consider that Saturn might represent the structure of the childhood life itself, and how the role of the parents, both parents, might have influenced the child.
Interesting.
To what you said about the father, the 4th house, I guess in ancient Western astrology or Hellenistic astrology, is traditionally the father. I'm not sure about the 9th house, except for it being the house of the god, which, I just don't know the reference. I'm not saying you're wrong, Alex.
It's in Indian astrology.
Oh, okay, and that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
But like to what you were saying about the father and absent fathers, the sun in the 12th house, Saturn in the 12th house, both of those tend to be symbolic of having an absent father growing up. But I think that Sun Saturn stuff can kind of tie into it as well. Anyway, so the issue with insecurity, I think, has to do with when we're children, how we relate to our parents. They're the ones who are supposed to protect us and keep us safe. And so if we didn't have a presence there when we were children, we might have a greater risk of feeling instability or insecurity as adults. So anyway.
Yeah, that very much makes a lot of sense. And yeah, Saturn is a strange beast for sure. I don't know. I guess we're probably getting to where we should wrap up here soon. And I will just say that it's interesting how Saturn is in Indian tradition. Saturn is a neuter planet along with Mercury. So Saturn and Mercury sort of take on different roles depending what's going on. And Saturn traditionally represents people like eunuchs and people that are like in India, it'd be like the untouchable caste, the people that are just like the lowest echelon of society. Slaves is a pretty universal signification for Saturn. And Saturn also, I've realized too that from the old text, Saturn also represents any and all outcasts, like people who are on the other side of the wall, the metaphorical wall that sort of establishes the boundary of society.
Right,
So
right.
Saturn moving through Capricorn and then Aquarius, some of these kinds of themes are going to be potentially emphasized, like what side of the wall are you on? Where do you feel like burdened? Where do you feel perhaps
Well, you guys are
enslaved?
definitely on the inside side of the wall.
Well, I'm in New Mexico, and somehow I question if Trump knows that New Mexico is part of the United States. So
Well,
you never know.
if there is ever a wall, I'm getting my passport. Well, I have my passport, but I'm going to take my passport and my things, and I'm going to be flying over the big pond over to where you are, Alex, I guess, but more in Western Europe or something. I don't know if we're safe anywhere. But that's actually a point I made recently, was that walls are always built supposedly to keep people out, and then they're ultimately used to keep people in. And I think that people need to remember that.
Well, that's a
Yep.
delicate thing to touch upon, I think. But going back to what Lars said earlier about Saturn representing the slave, the outcast, the servant, the person who is subject to boundaries.
Yeah, like South American immigrants, Mexican South American immigrants in the U.S.
Yeah,
actually.
those are represented by Saturn.
Oh, definitely. Well, because of the way our
Yeah.
society treats them,
Sure.
unfortunately.
So
Yeah.
anyone who is represented, anyone who is subject to boundaries and limitation, even old people, diseased people, are represented by Saturn.
Yeah.
But then there is the opposite spectrum of boundaries, because Saturn, again, let's not forget the essence is boundary. But the people who handle, who create, who manage the boundaries are also represented by Saturn, and those are of course people of power, right? And we
Right.
know that the managers of boundaries, the establishers of boundaries, are also represented by Saturn. And other people who are represented by Saturn are people of lasting success, of lasting
Durability. Yeah.
of
Right.
durability, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
So
that was fun.
if someone is meant to like do something in their life that they will be known for 1,000 years from now, you will see Saturn play a role in that. So Saturn is all sides of the boundary of the limitation spectrum, not only the people who are subject to boundaries, but also the people who enforce those boundaries, because we make up everything, right? We make those boundaries up, most of them, right? If it's disease, if it's things like that, if it's old age, we obviously don't make that up. But it's important to not only consider Saturn as a representative of the unfortunate, it's also the extremely fortunate, right? The people who kind of control.
Well, it brings power. Yeah. A strong Saturn can bring a lot of power. Like, again,
Right.
old texts will say things like if Saturn's exalted in the 10th and the sun's in the first or something like that, you have a very powerful, successful owner of lands, properties, or a farmer, or, somebody like that. And I mean, it is very possible to, in this day and age, be making millions, if not billions of dollars farming,
Yeah.
or I'm thinking of the
Right.
funeral industry,
But with
too,
Saturn at the same
billions of
time,
dollars.
it's not really about, of course money comes with that, but with Saturn it's not really about the money and the size of your bank account.
That's
It's
true.
not about
Yeah.
that. You can have just $1 million, which for the upper echelon is basically nothing, but just
Right.
wield power, have control over
Well,
things,
right.
Right. Money
which give
brings,
you.
but money brings power is all I was trying
Well,
to say in
but
our
well,
modern
actually, well,
world.
not
Well,
necessarily, because
I think it does.
if you think of
There are
people
so many
like,
people who have a lot of money, but people who have, like, take politicians in the United States, for example. They have more power than someone who is a
that's right, and they may
billionaire.
not
No,
have as much
I don't
money.
think so. I don't think so, because
It just
they're all in the
depends.
pockets of the billionaires.
Well,
I
wait a
mean, it's
minute.
pretty obvious.
Wait. Let's take a step back for a second, because it's actually time to wrap it up. But
Right.
if we think about it from the perspective of money and power are not always the same thing, and I think it's important that there's two sides to this. So sometimes people who have a lot of money have a lot of influence, and that's really what we're talking about here is influence, which is a form of power. But then there are other examples like like Gandhi having a lot of power, but not having a lot of money, or
Sure. Yeah.
according to the New Testament, Jesus not having a lot of money but having lots and lots of power and influence.
Yeah.
Thousands of years later, like we have this religion built around this person or deity or whatever, and I think that there are examples of where power can bring you a lot of money and riches, but it's not always those things aren't always like tied together.
Synonymous. Yeah. I
Right.
wasn't trying to imply that.
Well, right,
Yeah,
and
yeah. Most of the
you were
time they
both saying
do
that.
come together. Yeah.
Right, you were both saying, but you were both adding one point to it, and so I was just trying to
Yeah.
bring it together.
Right.
But yeah, we are actually at the end of our show, so
All right, guys.
Alrighty.
This was an awesome session again for our second video. I think this went pretty well.
All right. Cool. Yeah.
I'm quite happy with what we managed to get out here.
yeah,
All right.
yeah, this is fun.
So
So
let's thank our master of the ceremonies, Lars.
Okay. All right.
And
Cool. And we'll see everybody next time.
yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you soon. So I'm James.
I'm
He's
Lars.
James.
He's James. He's Alex. I'm
right.
Lars.
And don't forget to. We should have actually said this at the beginning of the video, guys. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube
Right.
channel. More cool videos are coming your way.
Yeah, we're gonna be doing a lot more stuff. So we'll see everyone soon.
Thanks for watching. Ciao, ciao.
All
Bye.
right. Ciao.